The bruise on Alexa Collins's wrist had turned a sickly yellow-green by Thursday morning, but it was the fear in her eyes that told the real story. At 19, she had mastered the art of long sleeves and carefully arranged smiles, but she hadn't yet learned that some secrets are too dangerous to keep. What she didn't know was that Officer Daniel Martinez had been watching, noticing the patterns that others chose to ignore, and he was about to make a decision that would change everything.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Alexa Collins pressed her back against the cold bathroom door, listening to the heavy footsteps retreating down the hallway of their suburban Phoenix home. Her stepbrother, Jake Morrison's voice, still echoed in her ears, that low, threatening tone he used when their parents weren't around. She examined the fresh bruise forming on her forearm where he'd grabbed her, adding it to the mental catalog of injuries she'd been collecting for the past 8 months. "Nobody needs to know about this," she whispered to her reflection, practicing the phrase her stepmother, Linda Morrison, had drilled into her since the incidents began. Family business stays in the family. The house on Maple Ridge Drive looked perfect from the outside. Manicured lawn, white picket fence, 2-car garage with a basketball hoop that Jake never used anymore. Inside, it was a carefully orchestrated performance of normalcy that Alexa had become the unwilling star of. Her father, Robert Collins, had married Linda 2 years ago, bringing together what everyone called a blended family. Robert worked long hours as a regional sales manager, traveling frequently, leaving Alexa alone with Linda and Jake more often than not. What had started as awkward family dynamics had slowly morphed into something much darker. Jake Morrison was 22, 3 years older than Alexa, and had never quite adjusted to having a stepsister. Fresh out of college with a degree he wasn't using and no steady job, he spent most of his time in the basement, playing video games and nursing whatever grudge had taken root in his mind. Linda, desperate to keep her new marriage intact, had developed a talent for looking the other way. The first incident happened on a Tuesday in March. Alexa had been reaching for a glass in the kitchen cabinet when Jake appeared behind her, pressing too close, his hands finding her waist. When she'd pushed him away and told him to stop, he'd laughed it off as a joke. But his eyes held something that made her skin crawl. "You're being dramatic, Alexa," Linda had said when Alexa hesitantly brought it up later. "Jake's just trying to be friendly. You're both adults now. You need to learn to get along." The second incident was worse. Jake had cornered her in the laundry room, his hand covering her mouth when she tried to protest. He'd whispered things that made her stomach turn, things about what would happen if she kept being difficult. When she'd managed to get away and told Linda, the response was swift and chilling. "Your father doesn't need to know about this," Linda had hissed, her usually composed demeanor cracking just enough to reveal something cold underneath. "Do you want to destroy this family? Do you want to be responsible for breaking up another marriage?" Alexa's mother had died when she was 16. The divorce Linda was referencing was her father's first marriage, to Alexa's mom, which had ended in bitter fighting and custody battles before cancer took her mother away entirely. The guilt was a weapon Linda wielded with surgical precision. "Think about your father. He's finally happy again, finally found someone who loves him. Are you really going to be that selfish?" So, Alexa learned to be invisible. She perfected the art of avoiding Jake, of timing her movements around the house to minimize contact. She threw herself into her community college classes, spending long hours at the library, picking up extra shifts at the coffee shop where she worked part-time. Anything to stay away from home. But Jake seemed to enjoy the hunt. He would find ways to be where she was, appearing in the kitchen when she was making breakfast, blocking her path in narrow hallways, showing up in her bedroom doorway with excuses about looking for something. Each encounter escalated slightly, testing boundaries, pushing limits. The physical violence had started 3 weeks ago. Alexa had refused to give Jake $20 he demanded for gas money,
pointing out that she needed it for textbooks. His response had been swift, a hard shove against the wall that left her gasping and a whispered threat that next time would be worse. "You bruise easily," Linda had observed that evening, noticing the mark on Alexa's shoulder. "You should be more careful."
But it was the way Linda's eyes had lingered on the bruise, calculating and cold, that made Alexa realize her stepmother knew exactly what was happening, and she was choosing to do nothing. The isolation was perhaps the worst part. Alexa's closest friends had drifted away after high school, scattered to different colleges and different lives. She'd never been particularly close to extended family, and her father's frequent business trips meant their conversations were rushed phone calls where she couldn't bring herself to shatter his happiness with the truth. "How's everything at home, sweetheart?" Robert would ask, his voice warm with contentment. "Linda says you and Jake are getting along better." "Everything's fine, Dad," Alexa would lie, hating herself for it, but unable to find the words that wouldn't destroy everything. This morning had been different, though. Jake had been drinking. She could smell it on his breath when he'd grabbed her in the hallway, his fingers digging into her wrist as he'd pressed her against the wall. His words had been more explicit, his intentions clearer, and for the first time, Alexa had genuinely feared what might happen next. "You're going to stop playing hard to get," he'd slurred, his face too close to hers. "We both know you want this. And nobody's going to believe you if you say otherwise." The threat hung in the air even now, an hour later, as Alexa sat on her bed staring at her phone. She'd pulled up the contact information for the Phoenix Police Department 3 times, her finger hovering over the call button, but Linda's words echoed in her mind. "Nobody can know. Nobody will believe you anyway." Outside her window, she could see Mrs. Chen tending to her garden next door, Mr. Rodriguez washing his car across the street, the mail carrier making his rounds. Normal people living normal lives, blissfully unaware that behind the pristine facade of 2847 Maple Ridge Drive, a 19-year-old girl was slowly disappearing. Alexa had always been the responsible one, the good daughter who got decent grades and didn't cause trouble. Her mother's death had only reinforced this lesson. Life was fragile, families were precious, and her job was to protect what remained. But sitting there, staring at her bruised wrist, something small and fierce began to stir in her chest. It was barely a whisper at first, drowned out by years of conditioning and fear, but it was there. The recognition that what was happening to her was wrong, that she deserved better, that silence wasn't protection, it was surrender. The house settled around her with its familiar creaks and sighs, but for the first time in months, Alexa didn't feel entirely alone. Somewhere in the growing awareness of her situation was the seed of something that hadn't existed before, the possibility that she didn't have to accept this as her reality. She didn't know yet that her small acts of resistance, the way she'd started documenting incidents in her journal, the careful photographs she'd taken of bruises, the increasingly frequent trips to public places, had created a pattern visible to trained eyes. She didn't know that Officer Daniel Martinez had been watching, or that her stepmother's carefully constructed world of silence was about to collide with someone who refused to look away. But change was coming, whether Linda Morrison wanted it or not. The question was whether Alexa would be ready when it arrived. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Officer Daniel Martinez had been patrolling the Maple Ridge neighborhood for 3 years, and he'd learned to read the subtle signs that most people missed. The way certain houses felt different when you drove past them, the patterns in emergency calls, the careful politeness that sometimes masked deeper problems. Number 2847 had been on his mental radar for weeks now, not because of any official reports, but because of what he wasn't seeing. The Collins-Morrison household appeared perfect on paper. No domestic disturbance calls, no complaints from neighbors, no obvious red flags in their background checks. But Daniel had noticed other things. The way the young woman, Alexa, according to the mailbox,
seemed to time her comings and goings very specifically, always looking over her shoulder before entering the house. The way she'd started parking her old Honda Civic at the far end of the driveway instead of in the usual spot. Small changes that suggested someone trying to minimize their presence in their own home. This Tuesday morning, as Daniel made his routine patrol down Maple Ridge, he saw Alexa hurrying toward her car with a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. Even from a distance, he could see the tension in her posture, the quick, nervous glances back at the house. She was wearing a long-sleeved shirt despite the Arizona heat climbing toward 95 degrees. Daniel slowed his patrol car and rolled down the window. "Morning, Miss Collins. Everything okay?" Alexa froze like a deer in headlights, her keys halfway to the car door. Up close, Daniel could see what he'd suspected. The careful makeup that didn't quite hide the shadow of a bruise along her jawline, the way she unconsciously favored her left arm. "Oh, yes, sir. Everything's fine," she said quickly, her voice pitched higher than normal. "Just running late for class." "Arizona State?" Daniel asked, conversationally, though he already knew from his previous observations that she attended Phoenix Community College. "Actually, PCC," Alexa corrected, relaxing slightly at the normal question. "I'm in their nursing program." "Good for you. That's important work." "You know, Miss Collins, I've been working this neighborhood for a while now. Sometimes people in this line of work, we develop instincts about when something's not quite right. If you ever need anything at all, you know you can call, right? Even if it seems small or you're not sure if it's worth bothering anyone about." Alexa's hand tightened on her car keys, and for a moment, Daniel thought he might say something real. But then her shoulders squared in that familiar way he'd seen too many times before, the moment when someone decided to retreat back into their protective shell. "I appreciate that, Officer Martinez," she said, reading his name tag. "But really, everything's fine. Thank you, though." As she drove away, Daniel made a mental note to increase his patrols past the house. His partner, Sarah Chen, had always teased him about his intuition, but 23 years in law enforcement had taught him the difference between paranoia and pattern recognition. Back at 2847 Maple Ridge Drive, Linda Morrison watched from the kitchen window as the patrol car slowly continued down the street. She'd seen the conversation, noted the way Alexa had tensed up, and felt a familiar cold knot form in her stomach. "Was that a cop talking to Alexa?" Jake asked from behind her, his voice still rough with sleep and last night's beer. "Just a routine patrol," Linda said carefully. "Nothing to worry about." But that wasn't entirely true. Linda Morrison had built her entire adult life on the art of managing appearances, and she recognized a potential threat when she saw one. Her first marriage had ended messily, leaving her with Jake and a mountain of debt. Meeting Robert Collins had been a lifeline, a stable man with a good job and insurance and a beautiful house in a safe neighborhood. She wasn't about to let anything jeopardize that security. The problem was that Jake had always been challenging. Even as a child, he'd had anger issues, problems with authority, a tendency toward what therapists had carefully termed boundary testing. She'd managed to get him through high school mostly by switching schools 3 times and learning which teachers to charm and which problems to minimize. When Jake did come home from college last year, taking a break, as how she phrased it to Robert, though the truth involved academic probation and an incident with a female classmate that had nearly resulted in charges, Linda had hoped that maturity and the structure of living in Robert's house might settle him down. Instead, Jake had fixated on Alexa in a way that made Linda's skin crawl, even as she forced herself to rationalize it away. Boys will be boys. Sibling rivalry is normal. Alexa was probably misinterpreting things. She'd always been dramatic, oversensitive. But Linda wasn't stupid. She knew what she saw in Jake's eyes when he looked at his stepsister, recognized the predatory patience in the way he engineered opportunities to be alone with her. The difference was that Linda had made a calculated decision that her security mattered more than Alexa's comfort. "She's been acting weird lately," Jake said now, pouring coffee into a mug that he wouldn't bother to wash later. "Jumpy, like she's got something to hide."
Linda turned from the window, studying her son's face. At 22, Jake still had the boyish features that had gotten him out of trouble his whole life. but there was something harder around his eyes now, something that reminded her uncomfortably of his father. "Maybe you should give her some space," Linda suggested carefully. "Alexa's at a difficult age. The transition to college, being part of a blended family, it's a lot for someone her age to handle." Jake's laugh was short and ugly. "Right, like little Princess Alexa has any real problems, living in this house, dad paying for her school, not having to work for anything." The resentment in his voice was thick enough to cut, and Linda felt that familiar maternal impulse to protect her son, even when she knew he was wrong, even when she was beginning to suspect he was dangerous. "Your stepfather works very hard to provide for this family," she said instead. "We all need to do our part to make this work." What she didn't say was that making it work increasingly felt like playing an elaborate shell game, constantly shifting attention and blame to avoid acknowledging the truth that was becoming harder to ignore. That evening, when Robert called from his hotel in Denver, Linda worked to keep her voice light and normal as she updated him on household matters. "How are the kids getting along?" Robert asked, and Linda could hear the hope in his voice. He wanted so badly for their blended family to succeed, for his daughter to have the stability he'd never been able to provide during those difficult years after his first wife's death. "They're adjusting," Linda said carefully. "You know how it is with young adults. Everyone's trying to find their place." "Alexis sounded a little stressed when I talked to her yesterday. She said something about her classes being harder than expected. Maybe I should call her again tonight." "She's probably studying. You know how dedicated she is to school. Maybe give her some space to focus on her finals." It was a small lie, designed to buy time and maintain peace, but it was also another brick in the wall Linda was building between Robert and the reality of what was happening in his house. Each conversation required more careful navigation, more strategic omissions, more elaborate explanations for things that shouldn't need explaining. After hanging up, Linda found herself standing in the middle of her pristine living room, surrounded by the material evidence of the life she'd worked so hard to build. The leather furniture Robert had bought when they'd gotten married, the family photos she'd carefully arranged on the mantel, the wedding portrait that showed them both looking hopeful and happy. She thought about the conversation with Officer Martinez that she'd witnessed that morning, about the way Alexa had been avoiding common areas of the house lately, about the increasing frequency of Jake's bad days when he drank too much and his temper got shorter. Linda Morrison had spent her entire adult life learning how to survive, how to adapt, how to make the best of difficult situations. She'd raised Jake largely alone after his father had disappeared when he was 12, working 2 jobs and taking night classes to become a dental hygienist. She'd clawed her way to stability through sheer determination and strategic thinking. But standing there in her beautiful living room, Linda realized that her survival instincts might be leading her towards something unforgivable. The question was whether she was strong enough to change course, or whether she'd already gone too far down a path that led nowhere good. Upstairs, Alexa sat at her desk trying to focus on an anatomy textbook, but the words kept blurring together. Her phone buzzed with a text from her lab partner asking about their study session tomorrow, and she realized she'd forgotten to respond to 3 messages from friends over the past week. She was disappearing, piece by piece, and the people who should have noticed were either too busy or too invested in not seeing. But Officer Martinez had noticed. For just a moment this morning, talking to him by her car, Alexa had felt seen in a way she'd almost forgotten was possible. The question was whether one person's attention would be enough to break through the wall of silence that had become her prison.
The Phoenix Community College Library had become Alexa's sanctuary, and she'd claimed the same corner table on the 3rd floor for the past 2 weeks. Surrounded by medical textbooks and the quiet hum of students studying, she felt safer than she had anywhere else in months. It was here, among the anatomy diagrams and nursing case studies, that she'd started keeping what she privately called her documentation. The small leather journal had been a Christmas gift from her father 2 years ago, back when her biggest concerns were choosing a major and whether she'd pass chemistry. Now its pages contained a different kind of education. Dates, times, descriptions of incidents, and photographs she'd learned to take discreetly with her phone's camera. March 15th. Jake cornered me in laundry room, made inappropriate comments about my body, blocked exit when I tried to leave. March 28th. Grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave marks when I refused to give him money for beer. Linda saw bruises, said I need to be more careful. April 5th. Found him going through my dresser drawers. When confronted, claimed he was looking for Linda's sweater. Threatened consequences if I told Dad. The entries went on, each one a small act of rebellion against Linda's insistence that nothing was really happening. Writing it down made it real in a way that her stepmother's gaslighting couldn't touch. Alexa. She looked up to find her study partner, Marcus Rivera, approaching with 2 coffee cups from the campus cafe. Marcus was in his second year of the nursing program, a former Army medic who decided to pursue healthcare after his discharge. At 24, he had a steadiness that most of their classmates lacked, and he'd become something close to a friend over the past semester. "Thought you might need caffeine," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "You look like you haven't been sleeping." Alexa quickly closed the journal and accepted the coffee gratefully. "Thanks. Yeah, just family stuff keeping me up." Marcus studied her face with the kind of clinical attention he learned in the military, noting things she wished he wouldn't see. "Family stuff can be rough. You want to talk about it?" For a moment, she considered it. Marcus had mentioned growing up in a household with domestic violence, had spoken in their clinical discussions about recognizing signs of abuse. If anyone would understand, it would be him. But Linda's voice echoed in her mind. "Nobody will believe you. You'll destroy this family. Your father will never forgive you." "It's nothing I can't handle," Alexa said instead, opening her pathophysiology textbook. "Just typical step-family adjustment issues." Marcus didn't look convinced, but he respected her boundaries and switched to discussing their upcoming exam on cardiac medications. As they studied, Alexa found herself grateful for the normalcy of academic pressure, for problems that had clear solutions and textbook answers. Her phone buzzed with the text from Linda. "Dad coming home early today. Family dinner at 6. Don't be late." The message sent a familiar spike of anxiety through Alexa's chest. Family dinners were performances, carefully orchestrated events where everyone played their assigned roles. Robert would ask about school and work, beaming with pride at her achievements. Linda would serve his favorite meal and guide conversations away from anything uncomfortable. Jake would be on his best behavior, charming and helpful, the son Robert had never had. And Alexa would smile and nod and pretend that everything was perfect, because that's what kept the peace and protected her father's happiness. "I have to go," she told Marcus, packing up her books more quickly than necessary. "Family thing." "Hey," Marcus said as she stood to leave. "I meant what I said about talking. Sometimes an outside perspective helps, and if you ever need somewhere safe to go." He pulled out his phone and quickly texted her his address. "My roommate and I have a couch, no questions asked." The kindness in his offer almost undid her carefully maintained composure. Alexa nodded quickly and hurried away before she could say something that would make this real, that would acknowledge what they both suspected, but neither had named. At home, the familiar ritual of preparation was already underway. Linda bustled around the kitchen preparing Robert's favorite pot roast. The dining room table was set with the good china, and Jake was actually dressed in clean clothes instead of his usual rumpled t-shirt and jeans. "There you are," Linda said as Alexa entered through the back door. "Go change into something nice. Your father's flight landed 20 minutes ago." Alexa hurried upstairs, passing Jake on the landing. He was leaning against the wall, blocking most of the narrow space, and she had to squeeze past him to get by. As she did, his hand brushed against her hip in a way that could have been accidental if not for the deliberate pressure and the small smile that played at the corners of his mouth. "Looking forward to dinner," he said quietly, his voice carrying an undercurrent that made her skin crawl.
In her room, Alexa changed into a modest blue dress and cardigan, checking herself in the mirror to make sure no bruises were visible. The fading marks on her wrist had nearly disappeared, but she kept the long sleeves anyway. She'd learned that prevention was easier than explanation.
The sound of her father's car in the driveway sent a flutter of genuine happiness through her chest. Despite everything, Robert Collins remained the one person in the house who loved her unconditionally, who saw her as more than a problem to be managed or a target to be pursued. "There's my girl," Robert boomed as he came through the front door, arms open for the hug that Alexa melted into gratefully. At 52, her father was still strong and vital, his graying hair and laugh lines only making him more distinguished. "I missed you, sweetheart." "I missed you too, Dad," Alexa said, meaning it completely. The dinner that followed was a masterclass in family theater. Robert talked enthusiastically about his successful sales trip, praising Linda's cooking and asking detailed questions about everyone's week. "Jake's been such a help while you were gone," Linda said warmly. "He fixed that squeaking hinge on the pantry door and helped me organize the garage." "That's my boy," Robert said, clapping Jake on the shoulder with genuine affection. "I'm proud of you for stepping up." Alexa watched this performance with a mixture of heartbreak and rage. This version of Jake, helpful, respectful, charming, was so convincing that sometimes she wondered if she was losing her mind, if maybe Linda was right and she was making something out of nothing, dramatizing normal family conflicts. But then Jake's eyes would meet hers across the table, and she'd see the calculating look that meant he was enjoying this, enjoying the way he could transform himself so completely that any accusation she might make would seem absurd. "How's school going, honey?" Robert asked, turning his attention to Alexa. "Really well," she said, forcing brightness into her voice. "I got an A on my last pathophysiology exam, and my clinical rotations start next semester." "That's wonderful! I'm so proud of you. My daughter, the nurse, your mother, would be so proud too." The mention of her mother sent a pang through Alexa's chest. Sarah Collins had been a nurse herself, working in pediatric oncology until the cancer that would eventually take her life made continuing impossible. She'd been fierce and protective, with an intuition about people that Alexa now desperately wished she'd inherited. "She would have loved seeing you follow in her footsteps," Robert continued softly. Alexa smiled and nodded, but internally she was screaming. Her mother would have seen through Jake's performance in minutes. She would have recognized the danger and acted without hesitation to protect her daughter. Sarah Collins would never have prioritized keeping the peace over keeping Alexa safe. After dinner, as Linda served coffee and Robert's favorite peach cobbler, the conversation turned to summer plans. "I was thinking we could take a family vacation," Robert suggested. "Maybe rent a cabin in Flagstaff for a week, get out of this heat, and spend some quality time together." The idea of being trapped with Jake in an isolated cabin for a week made Alexa's blood run cold, but she kept her expression neutral. "That sounds lovely," Linda said quickly. "What do you think, kids?" "Sounds great, Dad," Jake said with convincing enthusiasm. "It'll be fun to have some real family bonding time." The way he said bonding made Alexa's skin crawl, but Robert looked so pleased with the positive response that she couldn't bring herself to object. "Alexa, what do you think, sweetheart?" "It sounds nice," she managed, though her voice came out smaller than she had intended. "I'll have to check my work schedule." After her father went upstairs to unpack and Linda busied herself with dishes, Jake cornered Alexa in the living room. "A whole week in the mountains," he said, his voice low and pleased. "Just the family, nice and isolated. Lots of opportunities for bonding." The threat in his words was unmistakable, and for the first time, Alexa realized that her situation was escalating beyond her ability to manage through avoidance and silence. The journal in her backpack felt suddenly inadequate, her careful documentation meaningless if she didn't have the courage to act on it. That night, lying in bed and listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around her,
Alexa made a decision that would change everything. She was going to call Officer Martinez. She didn't know what she would say or if he would believe her or what consequences would follow, but Marcus's offer of help, her father's loving pride, and Jake's increasingly bold threats had combined to create something she hadn't felt in months, the conviction that she deserved better than this. Tomorrow, she would take the first real step towards freedom. Tonight, she would plan exactly what she was going to say.
Alexa's hands were shaking as she dialed the non-emergency number for the Phoenix Police Department. She'd practiced what she would say a dozen times in the mirror, but now that the moment had arrived, her carefully rehearsed words seemed to dissolve on her tongue. "Phoenix Police, how can I help you?" "Hi, I was wondering if I could speak with Officer Martinez. Daniel Martinez? He patrols the Maple Ridge area." "Is this an emergency, ma'am?" "No, it's about a family situation. He told me I could call if I needed anything." There was a pause, the sound of typing, then, "Officer Martinez is currently on patrol. Can I have him call you back, or would you prefer to speak with someone else?" Alexa almost hung up. The courage that had carried her through dialing the number was evaporating quickly, replaced by Linda's voice echoing in her mind. "Nobody will believe you. You'll destroy everything." "I'll wait for him to call back," she said finally, giving her name and number before ending the call. She was sitting in her Honda in the parking lot of the community college, having driven there immediately after her morning classes, specifically to make this call away from the house. Now she had to wait, and waiting meant time for doubt to creep in, time for fear to override determination. Her phone rang 20 minutes later. "Miss Collins, this is Officer Martinez. I understand you wanted to speak with me?" Daniel's voice was calm and professional, but she could hear something else underneath, a quality of attention that told her he was taking this seriously. "Yes, Alexa closed her eyes, trying to find the words. "You said if I ever needed anything I could call, and I think I might need help. I'm glad you called. Are you somewhere safe right now where we can talk?" "Yes, I'm at school. Officer Martinez, what I'm about to tell you, my family doesn't know I'm calling, and they can't know. If they find out," she trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Alexa, I want you to know that anything you tell me will be handled appropriately and professionally. My job is to keep people safe, not to make situations worse. Can you tell me what's been happening?" The kindness in his voice nearly undid her, but Alexa forced herself to stay focused. She'd brought her journal, and she opened it now, using her carefully documented timeline to walk Officer Martinez through the escalating pattern of Jake's behavior. She told him about the inappropriate touching, the threatening comments, and the physical violence that had started 3 weeks ago. She described Linda's responses, the way her stepmother had systematically dismissed and minimized every incident. She even mentioned the upcoming family vacation that filled her with dread. "Alexa, I want you to know that what you're describing constitutes harassment and assault. This is not normal sibling behavior, and it's not something you should have to handle alone. You've been very brave to reach out." "But what can we do?" Alexa asked, voicing the question that had kept her awake all night. "It's my word against his, and he's so careful. Linda will back him up, and my father—" I can't finish that sentence either. "Let me ask you this. Do you have any physical evidence, photos of bruises, text messages, anything that documents what's been happening?" "I have pictures," Alexa said, pulling out her phone, "and my journal with dates and descriptions of everything." "That's excellent thinking on your part. Alexa, I want you to send those photos to my official email address, and I want you to keep that journal safe. What you've done, documenting everything, that shows remarkable strength and intelligence." For the first time in months, Alexa felt a flutter of hope. What happens next? "I'm going to need to investigate this officially," Daniel explained. "That means I'll need to interview Jake and Linda and possibly your father as well. I won't be able to keep this completely confidential once I start the investigation process." The hope flickered and dimmed. "They'll know I called you. They'll know someone reported concerning behavior. It doesn't have to be you specifically.
Sometimes neighbors notice things, teachers become concerned, medical professionals are required to report suspicious injuries. There are many ways these situations come to light. Alexa considered this. It wasn't perfect protection, but it was something. How long do I have before... I can give you a few days to prepare, but Alexa, I don't want you to be alone with Jake if possible. Is there somewhere safe you can stay? She thought of Marcus's offer, of the couch he had mentioned. Maybe. Yes, I think so. Good. And if anything happens before I can get this investigation started, anything at all, you call 911 immediately. Don't worry about whether it seems serious enough or whether you're overreacting. Trust your instincts.
After they hung up, Alexa sat in her car for a long time, processing what she'd just set in motion. There was no going back now. By the end of the week, her carefully maintained family facade would be shattered, and she had no idea what would be left in its aftermath. That evening, she arrived home to find her father in his study, working on his laptop with papers spread across his desk. The domestic scene was so normal, so comfortable, that for a moment she almost convinced herself she was making a mistake. "Hey, Dad," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk the way she had countless times growing up. "Hey, sweetheart, how was school?" Robert looked up from his work, giving her his full attention in the way that had always made her feel special. "It was good." "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course. What's on your mind?" Alexa had rehearsed this conversation too, though it was almost harder than calling Officer Martinez had been. "If something was wrong, really wrong, in our family, would you want to know about it? Even if it meant things might get complicated?" Robert's expression grew more serious. "Alexa, is something wrong?" She could see the concern in his eyes, the way he leaned forward slightly, ready to protect and fix whatever problem she might present. For just a moment, she considered telling him everything, right here, right now, before the official investigation began. But then she heard Linda's footsteps in the hallway and Jake's voice calling something from the kitchen, and she remembered how good Jake was at performing, how skilled Linda was at managing appearances. "I just want to know that if I ever needed to tell you something difficult, you'd listen," she said instead. "Alexa, you can tell me anything, anything at all. You're my daughter, and nothing will ever change that." Robert reached across the desk to squeeze her hand. "I love you more than anything in this world, and I will always be on your side." The sincerity in his voice brought tears to her eyes. "I love you too, Dad." Later that night, Alexa packed a small bag with essentials and hid it in her closet. She texted Marcus, asking if his offer of a couch was still available, and felt a surge of gratitude when he immediately responded with his address and an assurance that she was welcome any time. She was brushing her teeth when Jake appeared in the bathroom doorway, startling her. "Busy day today?" he asked casually, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. "You seemed distracted at dinner." "Just school stuff," Alexa said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Lots of studying." Jake stepped fully into the bathroom, and she realized he was blocking her exit. The familiar surge of fear rushed through her, but this time it was accompanied by something else: anger. "You know, Alexa," Jake said, moving closer, "I've been thinking about our vacation. All that time together. All those opportunities for us to really get to know each other better." His hand reached out toward her face, and for the first time in months, instead of freezing or trying to escape, Alexa stepped back and spoke clearly. "Don't touch me, Jake." He looked surprised, then amused. "What did you say?" "I said, don't touch me. I don't want you to touch me, and I don't want to spend time alone with you. Leave me alone." For a moment, something dangerous flashed in Jake's eyes, and Alexa thought he might escalate to physical violence right then and there. But then they both heard Robert's voice from downstairs, calling goodnight to Linda, and Jake's expression shifted back to that familiar mask of normalcy. "You're being dramatic again, little sister," but his voice carried a new edge. "We'll have to work on that attitude of yours." He left without another word, but Alexa could feel that something fundamental had changed. She'd drawn a line, spoken up for herself in a direct way she never had before. It felt terrifying and empowering at the same time. As she lay in bed that night, her packed bag hidden in the closet and Officer Martinez's phone number saved in her contacts, Alexa realized she was no longer the same person who had pressed herself against the bathroom door just a few weeks ago. The process of reaching out for help, of documenting her experiences, of speaking her truth out loud, had started to transform her. The testing ground was prepared. Tomorrow, Officer Martinez would begin his investigation, and everything would change. But tonight, for the first time in months, Alexa Collins fell asleep feeling like she had some measure of control over her own life.
Officer Daniel Martinez arrived at 2847 Maple Ridge Drive on a Thursday afternoon when he knew Robert Collins would be at work. He'd spent the previous 2 days building his case file, reviewing Alexa's photographs and journal entries, and consulting with the domestic violence unit about the best approach for what was clearly a volatile situation. Linda Morrison answered the door with her practiced smile, but Daniel could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands smoothed her blouse nervously. "Mrs. Morrison, I'm Officer Martinez with Phoenix PD. I'd like to speak with you and your son Jake about some concerns that have been brought to our attention regarding this household." The color drained from Linda's face, but her voice remained steady. "I'm sorry, officer, but I'm not sure what you mean. Is there some kind of problem?" "May I come in? This is a matter that requires some privacy." Linda stepped aside reluctantly, leading him to the living room where Jake was sprawled on the couch playing video games. At the sight of the police officer, Jake paused his game but didn't stand up, a calculated show of casual disrespect that Daniel noted immediately. "Jake Morrison?" Daniel asked, pulling out his notebook. "Yeah, that's me. What's this about?" Daniel had conducted hundreds of these interviews over his career, and he'd learned to read the micro-expressions that people couldn't control. Linda's fear was obvious, the rapid blinking, the way she perched on the edge of her chair as if ready to flee. But Jake's response was more complex. Surprise, yes, but also a kind of predatory alertness, like an animal assessing a potential threat. "We've received reports of concerning behavior in this household, specifically allegations of harassment and physical intimidation directed at Alexa Collins." "That's ridiculous," Linda said immediately, her voice rising slightly. "Alexa is a wonderful girl, but she's always been prone to dramatics. This is just typical teenage behavior, sibling rivalry, adjustment issues from the blended family situation." "Mrs. Morrison? Alexa is 19 years old. This isn't teenage behavior we're discussing." Daniel turned to Jake. "I'd like to hear your perspective on your relationship with your stepsister." Jake shrugged, a gesture designed to convey indifference, but that Daniel recognized as carefully calculated. "Look, Alexa's never really adjusted to having me as a brother. She's always been daddy's little princess, having to share attention, share space. It's been hard for her. Sometimes she misinterprets things." "What kinds of things might she misinterpret?" "Normal family interactions. Like, if I try to be friendly, she acts like I'm invading her space. If I ask to borrow money or something, she makes it sound like I'm threatening her. She's just not used to having a brother." The explanation was smooth, rehearsed, and Daniel could see how it might be convincing to someone who wanted to believe it. But he'd seen the photographs Alexa had taken, the carefully documented bruises that told a different story. "Jake, I'm going to ask you directly. Have you ever put your hands on Alexa in anger? Have you ever made inappropriate comments about her body or threatened her in any way?" "Absolutely not," Jake said, and for the first time he sat up straighter, his voice carrying conviction. "I would never hurt Alexa. She's my sister." Linda nodded emphatically. "Officer Martinez, I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. This family has been through so much. Robert lost his first wife. I'm a single mother trying to blend our families. We're all doing our best, but maybe the stress has made Alexa imagine things that aren't really happening. It was a masterful performance, Daniel had to admit. Linda's protective mother act and Jake's wounded brother routine were both convincing enough that he could understand how they'd managed to keep this situation hidden for so long. Mrs. Morrison, are you aware that failure to protect a minor or young adult from abuse in your household can result in charges against you as well? Linda's carefully composed expression cracked slightly. Officer, I'm telling you that no abuse is happening in this house. Alexa is safe here. She's loved here. Then you won't mind if I speak with her directly. Of course not, Linda said quickly. But she's at school right now, and this afternoon she has work. She's very busy with her nursing program.
Daniel had expected this deflection. I'll arrange to speak with her separately. In the meantime, I want to be very clear about something. We will be monitoring the situation closely. If any retaliation occurs against Alexa for this investigation, there will be immediate consequences. After the officer left, the house fell into a silence that felt dangerous. Linda stood at the window watching his patrol car disappear down the street, her mind racing through the implications of what had just happened. How did this happen? She said finally, not turning around. You tell me, Jake said, and the casual mask he'd worn during the interview was gone now, replaced by something cold and angry. I thought you said you had her under control. Linda turned to face her son, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in years. The boyish features that had gotten him out of trouble his whole life couldn't hide the predatory intelligence in his eyes, the way he was already calculating his next move. What did you do to her, Jake? Nothing she didn't deserve, he said flatly. Little princess thought she could just ignore me, treat me like I don't exist in my own house. I was just helping her understand how things work in a real family. The casual cruelty in his voice made Linda's stomach turn, but she forced herself to focus on the immediate problem. We need to call Robert. We need to get ahead of this before... Before what? Jake interrupted. Before Daddy's little girl destroys everything we've built here? I don't think so. Jake, what are you talking about? He stood up, and Linda was suddenly aware of how much bigger he'd gotten over the past few years, how the boyish features that had gotten him out of trouble his whole life couldn't hide the predatory intelligence in his eyes, the way he was already calculating his next move. What did you do to her, Jake? Nothing she didn't deserve, he said flatly. Little princess thought she could just ignore me, treat me like I don't exist in my own house. I was just helping her understand how things work in a real family. The casual cruelty in his voice made Linda's stomach turn, but she forced herself to focus on the immediate problem. We need to call Robert. We need to get ahead of this before... Before what? Jake interrupted. Before Daddy's little girl destroys everything we've built here? I don't think so. Jake, what are you talking about? He stood up, and Linda was suddenly aware of how much bigger he'd gotten over the past few years, how the boyish features that had gotten him out of trouble his whole life couldn't hide the predatory intelligence in his eyes, the way he was already calculating his next move. What did you do to her? Nothing she didn't deserve, he said flatly. Little princess thought she could just ignore me, treat me like I don't exist in my own house. I was just helping her understand how things work in a real family. The casual cruelty in his voice made Linda's stomach turn, but she forced herself to focus on the immediate problem. We need to call Robert. We need to get ahead of this before... Before what? Jake interrupted. Before Daddy's little girl destroys everything we've built here? I don't think so. Jake, what are you talking about? He stood up, and Linda was suddenly aware of how much bigger he'd gotten over the past few years, how the boyish features that had gotten him out of trouble his whole life couldn't hide the predatory intelligence in his eyes, the way he was already calculating his next move. The trap Linda had built around herself was closing, and she could see no way out that didn't destroy everything she'd worked for. But looking at Jake now, seeing the person he'd become, she began to understand that maybe some things were worth destroying to save. Meanwhile, Alexa was finishing her shift at the coffee shop, unaware that her world was about to explode. Marcus had picked her up that morning and driven her to work, and he was coming back to get her,
Small kindnesses that felt enormous given everything else happening in her life. Her phone had been buzzing all afternoon with calls from Linda that she had ignored, following Officer Martinez's advice to avoid being alone with her family until the investigation progressed further. She had no way of knowing that those missed calls represented Linda's increasingly desperate attempts to warn her, or that Jake had spent the day planning something that would make all her careful documentation meaningless. As she locked up the coffee shop and waited for Marcus to pick her up, Alexa felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Cautious optimism. She had taken action, reached out for help, and the system was responding. Officer Martinez had believed her, had treated her situation seriously, had promised that things would change. What she didn't know was that Jake Morrison had decided that if he couldn't control her through fear and intimidation, he would control her through more permanent means. The breaking point had arrived, and the next few hours would determine whether Alexa's courage would be enough to save her life.
Linda Morrison sat in her car outside the Phoenix Community College campus, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She'd been waiting for 45 minutes, watching students come and go, searching for Alexa's familiar figure among the crowds. The 14 missed calls on her phone were all from Jake, each voicemail growing increasingly angry and demanding. She knew she was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. For 2 years, she'd chosen her own security over Alexa's safety, convinced herself that the situation was manageable, that Jake's behavior would eventually normalize. But sitting in her living room that afternoon, listening to her son calmly discuss staging Alexa's accident, Linda had finally seen the truth she'd been desperately avoiding. Jake wasn't acting out or going through a phase. He was dangerous in a way that made her previous rationalizations seem not just wrong, but complicit. Her phone buzzed with another call from Jake, and this time she answered. "Where the hell are you?" His voice was tight with barely controlled rage. "I'm running errands," Linda said, proud that her voice remained steady. "I'll be home later." "You need to come home now. We need to talk about our Alexa problem, and we need to handle it tonight before she has a chance to cause more trouble." The casual way he said "our Alexa problem" made Linda's stomach turn. "Jake, I think we should just let this blow over. The police officer seemed satisfied with our explanation." "Mom!" Jake's voice dropped to a tone Linda remembered from his childhood, the one that had always preceded his worst tantrums. "Come home! Now!" He hung up, and Linda stared at her phone, understanding that she just burned her bridges. Jake would know she'd chosen sides, and he'd respond accordingly. But for the first time in years, the thought of his anger didn't terrify her as much as the thought of what he might do to Alexa. 20 minutes later, she spotted Alexa walking toward the student parking lot with a young man Linda didn't recognize. They were talking animatedly about something, and seeing Alexa smile, really smile, reminded Linda of how different the girl had become over the past few months. How the bright, confident teenager who welcomed Linda into their family had gradually become someone guarded and fearful. Linda got out of her car and approached them, noting how Alexa's posture immediately tensed at the sight of her stepmother. "Alexa, we need to talk." The young man stepped slightly forward, a protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed. "Is everything okay?" he asked Alexa. "It's fine, Marcus," Alexa said, though her voice suggested otherwise. "This is my stepmother, Linda." Marcus nodded politely, but didn't move away, clearly prepared to stay if Alexa needed support. His presence gave Linda hope. It meant Alexa wasn't as isolated as Jake believed. "Could we have a moment alone?" Linda asked. Alexa looked at Marcus, who squeezed her shoulder briefly. "I'll be right over there," he said, pointing to a bench about 20 feet away. "Take your time." When they were relatively alone, Linda struggled to find the words that would convey the urgency of the situation without sounding completely unhinged. "Alexa, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You cannot go home tonight. You cannot go home at all until this situation with Jake is resolved." Alexa's eyebrows rose in surprise. "What are you talking about?" "The police officer came to the house today. He interviewed Jake and me about the incidents you reported." Linda watched Alexa's face carefully, seeing the mixture of fear and hope that crossed her features. "Jake knows you called the police, and he's not handling it well." "What do you mean he's not handling it well?" Linda took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to say would change everything between them forever. Jake's planning to hurt you, Alexa, really hurt you. He talked about staging an accident, making it look like you were under stress and something tragic happened. The color drained from Alexa's face. Are you serious? I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Linda reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. I've been documenting things too, things I told myself weren't important, incidents I minimized or ignored, bank records showing when Jake's behavior got worse after drinking, photos of damage he's done to the house when he was angry, copies of emails I sent to his college about concerning behavior.
Alexis stared at the envelope in shock. Why are you giving me this? Because I was wrong. The words came out in a rush. 2 years of guilt and rationalization collapsing into simple truth. I was wrong to protect him instead of you. I was wrong to ask you to stay silent. I was wrong to prioritize my marriage over your safety. Linda could see tears forming in Alexa's eyes, and she felt her own throat tighten with emotion. I told myself I was protecting a family, Linda continued, but what I was really protecting was my own comfort, my own security. I was so afraid of losing what I'd built with your father that I was willing to sacrifice you to keep it. Linda, let me finish, please. Linda's voice grew stronger as she spoke. Your mother would have protected you without hesitation. She would have seen through Jake immediately and acted to keep you safe. I know I can never replace her, and I've proven I'm not worthy to try, but I can stop failing you now. Alexa was crying openly now. Years of hurt and fear and desperate hope finally finding release. What do we do? First, you don't go home. You stay with your friend, with anyone who's safe. Second, we call Officer Martinez and tell him about Jake's threats. Third, we call your father and tell him everything. Everything? Alexa's voice was small. Everything, including my part in it, including how I failed to protect you. Linda felt a strange sense of relief at the thought of finally telling the complete truth. Your father deserves to know what's been happening in his house, and you deserve to have someone who will put your safety first. Alexa wiped her eyes with her sleeve, and Linda could see the teenager she'd once been, vulnerable but determined, hurt but not broken. What about Jake? Jake will face the consequences of his choices, Linda said firmly, and I'll face the consequences of mine. They were interrupted by Linda's phone ringing. Jake's name appeared on the screen, and both women stared at it. Don't answer it, Alexa said quickly. Linda looked at her stepdaughter, this brave young woman who'd found the courage to seek help despite everything Linda had done to silence her, and made another choice that felt like stepping into the light after years of darkness. She answered the phone and put it on speaker. Jake, I'm here with Alexa. Perfect. Both of you need to come home right now. We're going to sit down and have a family conversation about what happens when people don't know their place. The menace in his voice was unmistakable, and Linda saw Alexa flinch. But instead of the fear and compliance Jake was expecting, Linda felt something else rising in her chest, maternal fury that was 2 years overdue. No, Jake, we're not coming home, and we're not having any more family conversations that involve you threatening Alexa. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. When Jake spoke again, his voice was different, colder, more calculated. Mom, you're making a very big mistake. When Dad finds out what's been going on, what you let happen, do you really think he's going to choose you over his precious daughter? You're right, Linda said, surprising him. He won't choose me, and he shouldn't. But that doesn't mean I have to keep making the wrong choice. She hung up and immediately dialed Officer Martinez's number, her hands steady for the first time in months. Officer Martinez, this is Linda Morrison. I need to report an immediate threat against my stepdaughter Alexa Collins. My son Jake has threatened to stage an accident to hurt her tonight, and I believe he intends to carry out that threat tonight. As Linda spoke to the police officer, providing him with Jake's threats and offering to surrender the evidence she'd been secretly collecting, Alexa felt something shift inside her chest. The isolation that had been her constant companion for months was finally breaking apart. She wasn't alone anymore. She had Marcus offering friendship and support, Officer Martinez taking her situation seriously, and now, incredibly, Linda choosing to stand with her instead of against her. For the first time since this nightmare began, Alexa Collins felt like she might actually be safe. The arrest happened at 11:47 p.m. on a quiet Thursday night on Maple Ridge Drive. Jake Morrison had spent the evening destroying furniture in his rage, texting increasingly violent threats to both Alexa and Linda, and making the kind of mistakes that only someone who'd never faced real consequences would make. Officer Martinez had coordinated with a tactical unit, knowing from Linda's evidence and Jake's escalating behavior that this wouldn't be a routine arrest. When they surrounded the house, Jake was in the garage, loading a baseball bat and zip ties into his car, items that would later be classified as evidence of premeditated assault. He didn't go quietly. The booking photo that would eventually appear in local news showed a young man whose mask of normalcy had finally slipped completely, revealing the rage and entitlement that had been building for years. But by then, Jake Morrison had become someone else's problem, and Alexa Collins was finally free to begin rebuilding her life. Robert Collins arrived at Phoenix Police Headquarters at 2:30 a.m., having driven straight from the Denver airport after Linda's devastating phone call. He found his wife and daughter in a victim services room, sitting on opposite sides of a small table with the weight of 2 years' worth of secrets between them. "Dad!" Alexa stood up when he entered, uncertain of what she would see in his face. What she saw was a man whose world had just been turned upside down, whose fundamental understanding of his family and his choices had been shattered in a single phone conversation. But when he looked at her, his eyes held only love and regret. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," Robert said, pulling her into a fierce hug. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here. I'm so sorry I didn't see what was happening." "It's not your fault, Dad. Jake and Linda made sure you couldn't see." Robert looked over Alexa's shoulder at Linda, who was sitting very still, her hands folded in her lap. The woman he'd married, the person he'd trusted with his daughter's well-being, had become a stranger in the space of one phone call. "How long?" he asked quietly. 8 months of escalation, Linda said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But signs I should have recognized much longer than that." The silence that followed was heavy with questions that couldn't be answered quickly or easily. How do you forgive someone who failed to protect your child? How do you rebuild trust when the foundation has been completely destroyed? How do you move forward when moving forward means acknowledging that moving backward isn't possible? But those were conversations for later. Right now, they had immediate practical concerns to address. Detective Sarah Chen, who had taken over the case from Officer Martinez, briefed them on what would happen next. Jake had been charged with multiple felonies: stalking, assault, making terroristic threats, and attempted kidnapping based on the items found in his car. The evidence Linda had provided, combined with Alexa's documentation and the threatening voicemails Jake had left that evening, created a case so solid that the prosecutor was confident about conviction even without a trial. "Will he get bail?" Robert asked. "Given the nature of the threats and the evidence of premeditation, we're requesting he be held without bail," Detective Chen explained. "Even if he does make bail, there will be a no-contact order that includes staying away from this address and all family members." "What about the house?" Alexa asked. The thought of returning to Maple Ridge Drive, even without Jake there, filled her with anxiety. Robert and Linda exchanged a look that held 2 years' worth of unspoken communication. "We'll figure that out," Robert said gently. "Right now, let's focus on keeping you safe and getting through the legal process." Over the next few weeks, the ripple effects of that night spread outward in ways none of them had anticipated. Marcus Rivera, who had offered Alexa his couch, instead found himself part of an extended support network that included Officer Martinez, Detective Chen, and a victims advocate named Dr. Patricia Williams, who specialized in family violence cases. What had started as one person offering help had grown into a community of people committed to ensuring Alexa's recovery and safety. Dr. Williams became particularly important in helping Alexa understand that her experience wasn't unique or shameful. In their sessions, she learned about the psychology of predators who target family members, the way enablers rationalize their complicity, and most importantly, the strength it takes to break free from these dynamics.
What you did
documenting everything, reaching out for help, speaking your truth even when everyone around you was telling you to stay quiet, that wasn't luck, Dr. Williams told her during one of their sessions. That was courage and intelligence and survival instinct working together. I didn't feel courageous, Alexa admitted. I felt terrified most of the time. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Dr. Williams replied. It's doing what you know is right despite the fear. The legal proceedings moved faster than expected. Jake's public defender advised him to take a plea deal rather than go to trial, recognizing that the evidence against him was overwhelming and that a jury would likely impose harsher sentences than the prosecution was offering. He pled guilty to reduced charges and was sentenced to 4 years in prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation with mandatory counseling and a permanent no-contact order regarding Alexa and any future residents she might have. Linda's situation was more complicated. While she hadn't been charged criminally, the civil implications were significant. Robert filed for divorce, and in the settlement, Linda relinquished any claim to the house on Maple Ridge Drive or Robert's retirement accounts. She moved into a small apartment across town and began the process of rebuilding her life from scratch. But perhaps the most unexpected development came from Linda's testimony during Jake's sentencing hearing. "Your Honor," she said, standing at the defendant's table beside her son, "I want to acknowledge my role in enabling this situation. I taught my son that his comfort mattered more than his victim's safety. I taught him that family loyalty meant protecting abusers instead of protecting the abused." She turned to look at Alexa, who was sitting in the gallery with Robert and Marcus. "I failed in the most fundamental responsibility of any adult in a household with children, to ensure that home was a safe place. I cannot undo the harm I caused through my inaction, but I can commit to doing better in the future." Linda had started volunteering with a domestic violence organization, using her experience to help other family members recognize when they were enabling abuse. It was painful work that required her to confront her own past choices repeatedly, but she'd found purpose in helping others avoid the mistakes she'd made. Officer Martinez, who had been promoted to detective partly based on his handling of Alexa's case, started giving presentations at area high schools and colleges about recognizing domestic violence and the importance of trusting instincts when something feels wrong. "Most people want to help," he would tell students, "but they can only help if you give them the chance. Silence protects abusers, not victims." Phoenix Community College's nursing program, inspired by Alexa's story, implemented new training for faculty on recognizing signs of domestic violence in students and connecting them with resources. The coffee shop where Alexa worked started displaying information cards about domestic violence resources in their employee break room. Each of these changes was small individually, but together they represented something larger, a community that had been changed by one young woman's refusal to accept that abuse was normal or inevitable. 6 months after Jake's arrest, Alexa Collins stood in the kitchen of a new apartment she shared with Marcus and another nursing student, preparing for her clinical rotations that would begin in the fall. The apartment was small and modest, but it was truly safe in a way she'd almost forgotten was possible. Her father visited regularly, and their relationship had grown stronger through the crisis, built on complete honesty instead of careful avoidance of difficult topics. Linda sent cards occasionally, birthday wishes, graduation congratulations, but maintained the respectful distance they'd all agreed was necessary. Most remarkably, Alexa had found her voice in ways that extended far beyond her personal safety. She'd started speaking at high school assemblies about recognizing abuse and seeking help. She'd testified before the legislature in support of improved domestic violence training for law enforcement. She'd even been interviewed by a local news station about the importance of believing young women when they report family violence. The girl who had once pressed herself against bathroom doors in fear had become a young woman who opened doors for others struggling in similar situations. The ripple effects of her courage continued to spread, touching lives she would never know about, creating safety where there had been danger, and proving that one person's decision to speak truth can change everything.
2 years later, Alexa Collins stood at the podium in the Phoenix Convention Center, looking out at an audience of 800 law enforcement officers, social workers, and healthcare professionals attending the annual conference on domestic violence prevention. The young woman who once couldn't speak up in her own home now commanded the attention of hundreds of people whose job it was to protect others. "My name is Alexa Collins," she began, her voice clear and confident, "and I'm here to tell you about the power of one person who refuses to look away." In the audience, Detective Daniel Martinez sat in the front row, wearing his dress uniform and the commendation he'd received for developing new protocols for family violence investigations. Beside him sat Dr. Patricia Williams, who had left her private practice to head the new Family Violence Intervention Center that had been established partly due to the advocacy work that had grown from Alexa's case. 2 years ago, I was a 19-year-old college student living in what everyone thought was the perfect blended family, Alexa continued. From the outside, we had everything: a beautiful house, financial stability, parents who appeared loving and committed. But behind closed doors, I was being systematically terrorized by my stepbrother, while my stepmother chose silence over my safety. Her presentation wasn't just a recounting of her own story, though that remained powerful and important. Instead, Alexa had developed a comprehensive analysis of how family violence operates, how it's hidden, and most critically, how communities can create systems that make it impossible to ignore. "The statistics are staggering," she said, clicking to a slide that showed research data. 1 in 4 women will experience domestic violence in their lifetime. But what we talk about less is family violence, abuse that happens between non-romantic family members, step-families, extended families, households where power dynamics create opportunities for predators. In the back of the auditorium, Linda Morrison sat quietly, having driven 3 hours from Tucson to hear Alexa speak. In the 2 years since the divorce and Jake's imprisonment, Linda had completed a master's degree in social work and now ran support groups for family members who had enabled abuse. Her presence at the conference represented her own transformation, from someone who had caused harm to someone working to prevent it. She'd asked permission through intermediaries to attend today's presentation, wanting to witness what Alexa had become while respecting the boundaries that had been established between them. Seeing the confident, purposeful young woman at the podium, Linda felt a complex mixture of pride, regret, and hope. The key insight I want to share with you today is that predators rely on our collective willingness to maintain comfortable myths. They count on our desire to believe that families are inherently safe, that people in positions of authority have everyone's best interests at heart, that if something truly terrible were happening, someone would have already noticed and intervened. She clicked to another slide showing a photo of Officer Martinez during one of his community education presentations. But sometimes someone does notice. Sometimes a police officer decides to trust his instincts and check on a situation that seems off. Sometimes a classmate offers a couch without asking questions. Sometimes even someone who has been a part of the problem decides to become a part of the solution. The presentation shifted to focus on the systemic changes that had emerged from Alexa's case. Phoenix Community College had implemented mandatory domestic violence awareness training for all faculty and staff. The Phoenix Police Department had created new protocols for family violence investigations, recognizing that traditional domestic violence approaches didn't always apply to non-romantic family situations. Healthcare providers throughout the region had received training on identifying and responding to signs of family violence. Individual courage matters, but individual courage without systemic support often fails. What saved my life wasn't just my decision to speak up, it was discovering that there were systems and people ready to respond when I did. She told the audience about Marcus, who graduated nursing school the previous spring and now works in pediatric emergency medicine,
specializing in recognizing signs of child abuse, about Officer Martinez's promotion and his development of new training protocols, about Dr. Williams' expanded role in victim advocacy. Each person who chose to act created opportunities for others to act. Each person who refused to look away made it easier for the next person to see clearly. This is how change happens, not through single heroic moments, but through networks of people committed to doing better. The presentation concluded with practical recommendations for audience members, specific signs to watch for, protocols for intervention, resources for victims, and most importantly, ways to create environments where speaking up feels possible rather than dangerous.
During the question and answer session, a young police officer raised her hand. Ms. Collins, what would you say to someone who's in a situation like yours was? Someone who's afraid to speak up because they might destroy their family? Alexa paused, thinking about all the young women who had contacted her since her story became public. Students, daughters, sisters who recognized their own experiences in hers. I would say that families worth preserving don't require your silence about your own safety, she replied. And families that do require that silence are already broken. You're just revealing the damage, not causing it. After the conference ended, Alexa found herself approached by dozens of attendees, some sharing their own stories, others asking for advice about cases they were working on, still others simply wanting to thank her for her courage. Among them was a young woman about her own age who looked nervous but determined. Miss Collins, my name is Sarah Chen, Detective Chen's daughter. I'm starting college next year, and I wanted to ask, how do you find the courage to keep doing this, to keep talking about the hardest thing that ever happened to you? Alexa considered the question carefully. I think about all the versions of myself who might have existed if just one person had spoken up sooner, she said finally. The version who never had to learn what it felt like to be afraid in her own home. The version who could focus on school without constantly watching over her shoulder. The version who trusted that adults would protect her instead of sacrifice her for their own comfort. She paused, watching understanding dawn in the young woman's eyes. I can't save those versions of myself, but every time I tell this story, every time someone in the audience decides to pay attention to their instincts or believe a young person who's asking for help, maybe I save those versions of someone else. Later that evening, Alexis sat in the apartment she now shared with Marcus, who had become much more than a study partner over the past 2 years. They were planning their wedding for the following spring, a small ceremony focused on family they'd chosen rather than family they'd been assigned. Her father called, as he did every Sunday evening, to check in and share news from his own life. Robert had taken early retirement and was now volunteering with a men's organization that focused on helping fathers recognize signs of abuse in their households. I saw the news coverage of your presentation. I'm so proud of you, sweetheart, not just for what you've accomplished, but for who you have become. Thanks, Dad. I know this hasn't been easy for any of us. No, it hasn't, but we're all better people than we were 2 years ago, aren't we? Even if we had to go through hell to get here. It was true. The family that had existed on Maple Ridge Drive was gone, destroyed by the revelation of Jake's violence and Linda's complicity. But what had emerged from that destruction was something more honest, more intentional, and ultimately stronger. Alexa had built a chosen family that included Marcus, her father, Dr. Williams, Detective Martinez, and dozens of other people who had become part of her extended support network. She'd learned that family wasn't about blood relationships or legal documents. It was about people who showed up consistently, who told the truth even when it was difficult,
who prioritized safety over comfort. As she prepared for bed that night, Alexa reflected on how completely her life had changed. The scared 19-year-old who once hid bruises was now a confident advocate who traveled the country speaking about family violence prevention. The girl who had felt powerless in her own home now helped shape policies that protected others. But perhaps the most important change was simpler than all of that. Alexa Collins was no longer afraid. She moved through the world with the confidence of someone who knew that her voice mattered, that her safety was non-negotiable, that she had the power to create change. Tomorrow, she would start her new job as a coordinator for the Family Violence Intervention Center, working directly with Dr. Williams to develop programs for young adults in dangerous family situations. Next month, she would testify before Congress about the need for improved federal funding for family violence prevention programs. But tonight, she was simply a young woman who had survived something terrible and discovered that survival could become the foundation for something beautiful. As she turned off the lights and settled into bed beside the person who had chosen to love and protect her, Alexis smiled at the thought that her story, which had begun with such darkness, had become a source of light for others. The girl who had once whispered, "Nobody can know," had learned the transformative power of refusing to keep dangerous secrets, and in learning that lesson, she had given countless others permission to find their own voices, to seek their own help, to build their own new beginnings.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.